My first short documentary ended up getting selected for loads of film festivals, including BAFTA and Academy-qualifying festivals, and it even ended up winning a few of them too. And then it went on to get hundreds of thousands of views online when it was released. But I made so many mistakes along the way that I'm surprised it even ended up getting out there in the first place. Everything that they tell you not to do, I probably did in that first shoot, with no producer, hardly any budget, and no real safety net. It almost broke me and definitely almost broke the film. So this is the video that I wish I'd watched before I started making it. Mistake number one, I went way too big too soon. This short documentary was called Unconditional. It was about one of the world's leading canine behaviorists named Will Atherton and how his dog Sully saved his life after an attempted suicide. Before this, I had worked in commercials, branded docs, short form content, music videos, really kind of honing the technical skills of filmmaking and finding my own style and voice through that. But I'd never done a proper short documentary myself, so this was my first attempt at doing so. Having come from that commercial music video world, I really wanted to bring that cinematic quality to a short documentary format, which is where my ambitions kind of came from, to infuse documentary style with more of a cinematic quality. I really wanted to bring as much of that skill set that I'd found and that voice that I found in my other work into this short documentary project, which is what led to trying to push the boat out and do stunts and do crazy lighting rigs and do all that shooting on 16mm film and do all of those things. Because this was a self-funded passion project with very little money in it at all, there was no producer, no assistant director. It was literally just myself, my amazing DP Brendan Harvey, and a couple of camera assistants. That was it. That was the entire crew. What that meant was that my brain was split in a multitude of places, thinking about the logistics, locations, practicalities, thinking about all these things that could go wrong or could go right and how they're unfolding during the shoot and how they're intertwining with the narrative of the interview I'd just done. I was not fully focused and present on the shoot, thinking about the story and thinking about Will, the contributor. And I think the main takeaway from that is really, for a first short documentary project, start small. Like, if it's a good story, you don't need all these other crazy elements going on. You don't need any of that. You just need a good story and tell that story really well. That's it. And I think the knock-on effect of all of that was that it probably impacted the most important part of the shoot, which is my second point. I rushed the interview. So again, coming from that kind of commercial background and working with an extremely talented DP, we spent probably longer than we should have on the actual setup of the interview. And in terms of the schedule I planned for that day, what that meant was that we were eating into the actual interview time itself. And not only that, it meant that Will was kept waiting around until we were ready to roll, which meant a lot of him kind of sitting there twiddling his thumbs. And I don't think that's a good thing in terms of getting the contributor into the right headspace. What that did was also impact my interviewing ability, because I was getting a little bit stressed that we were running out of time or not having as much time as I wanted to kind of take Will on the emotional journey that I wanted to take him on during the interview. However, I was extremely lucky in that Will has been in front of a camera many, many, many times from being on social media so much. So there was no element of him needing to relax into the interview or get comfortable. So we were able to get to where we wanted to go quicker than I normally would be able to with other people. And also, we'd built a really good rapport before the shoot and had already talked about where we wanted to go with the interview. And he's very adept at storytelling and those kind of things. So we were able to talk quite honestly and openly about that. And all that meant that the interview went extremely well in the end, but only because of those factors. If this had been a different person who did not have any of those qualities, the time that we had sacrificed would have been extremely detrimental to what I was able to pull out of them during the interview, or what they were able to give to me during the interview. So the main takeaway for this is to try and always prioritize the actual interview itself, because yes, it's important that things look good, but there's a point of diminishing returns where actually what you're able to get from an interview is more important than how beautiful that interview looks in the end. But even though the conversation and interview went extremely well in the end, I did find a big problem when we eventually came into the edit, which is our next point. I underestimated the story structure that I had planned. I think it's important to remember that everyone's life is kind of a tapestry, and when you're doing a short documentary that can only be 10 to 15 minutes long, it's really important to focus in on the exact story you're trying to tell from that tapestry. And there were lots of elements we could have focused on with Will. There was his kind of social media success, his business success, fatherhood, and then his mental health journey. And I've worked out kind of how I wanted that structure to work before I came into the interview. But when it came to the edit and I started putting the interview together into that kind of 10, 15-minute format, I just felt that the kind of final act wasn't landing as well as I wanted it to. And normally when there's an act 3 problem, you look at act 1 to try and resolve it because it's normally in the setup that's the problem. That was exactly the case. I showed it to a couple of colleagues and they pointed out that the way I'd set it up wasn't as strong as it needed to be to get a payoff at the end. And I think that was because it was getting muddied with a couple of other elements that were in there that I was trying to get in because I felt it was important to say certain things or to point out certain successes that Will had had to honor him. But actually, in the end, I needed to strip those away so that the audience could really focus in on what the core story was, which was his connection with his dog and how that eventually led to his dog helping him after the suicide attempt. And there were too many things in Act 1 that were kind of clouding that singular story. So I needed to start taking those things out to provide clarity. But actually, I think that all came about as a result of this next point. I started editing too soon and was too close to the footage. I'm someone who likes to get projects done as quickly as I can do. I don't like things getting stagnant or going on for too long and dragging. I've seen too many people kind of work on projects for years and years only to never release them. And I really am a believer in kind of iterating and failing fast. The problem with that is that I tend to edit my own footage, and particularly with this one, but I have learned this lesson before, I just clearly haven't learned it well enough yet, is that I ran straight into the edit off the back of the shoot. And it was, as mentioned earlier, it was a very intense shoot, very mentally and physically draining. And it meant that I was very, very close to the footage. Running straight into the edit meant that my judgment was definitely clouded. I wasn't as objective as I needed to be. I couldn't see the things that we mentioned in the previous point as soon as I would have liked to, and I probably would have been able to had I given it even just a week or so, maybe a bit longer, maybe 2 weeks, to just step away, focus on some other things and come back with a fresh perspective and really kind of take off that director hat and put on the editor hat. It's really a skill that I've had to work on very, very hard over the number of years that I've been in the industry, is that ability to take off that hat and come back and look at the footage as if I'd never touched it, as if I'd never been on set, and just be as brutal as I would be if I were editing someone else's footage. So I definitely made that mistake on this one of rushing into the edit. And the main takeaway from that is just try and get some distance from it before you get into the edit so that you really have some clarity and perspective on the shoot and on the story you're trying to tell. And I think if you do that, you'll spot problems much, much quicker than if you had run straight into it. But I think during the edit, and definitely after the edit was finished, it became very apparent that there was something that I'd done, or actually something that I'd not done during the shoot, which I think we should have done, which is we missed intimacy by skipping any verite scenes. So I think one of the nicest things about documentaries is the ability to kind of feel a part of someone's world for a little while. And one of the ways of doing that is by capturing verite style scenes, kind of fly on the wall scenes. But I was so engrossed in this kind of cinematic quality to everything and having everything so pre-planned and pre-prescribed at what B-roll was going to go over what talking point from the interview and beat in the narrative, that actually we hardly shot any true verite style scenes. It definitely meant you lost some intimacy and connection with Will that I think you would have got more of and got to feel him a bit more and his life a bit more if you'd had one or two other kind of verite scenes in there where you really felt like you were just sitting in his life for a little while. And this brings me nicely onto our next point, which is all about justifying creative decisions. I'm a big believer that if you're going to make a creative decision, whatever that is, a lens to choose, an angle to choose, handheld, stabilized, whatever it is, it should always come from a justification based on the narrative or the theme. I don't believe in just picking something stylistically for the sake of it looking cool. I think it always needs to tie back into the theme or the narrative in some kind of way, because I think then you're influencing the audience in the correct way, using those elements to enhance the story rather than to detract from it, because you're focusing on how cool something looks rather than it feeling like it's infused in the theme and the kind of core of everything. And I think the mistake we very specifically made with our short doc was we shot some recreations of Will's childhood. And I know this is about to get very nitpicky, but it's a good explanation and kind of example of this. So we shot these recreations of his childhood and we opted to use 8mm film for that because it kind of had that nostalgic feel to it of a memory, but also probably because at the time we thought it would look quite cool. But in reality, that doesn't make any sense with the time period Will grew up in. And really, if we wanted to make that feel more authentic and more like an actual recreation of archive footage, we should have used VHS. And there were other VHS clips used in the film from Will's actual childhood. So I think that if we'd have shot those moments on VHS, it probably would have tied in more naturally to the rest of the film and not felt a little bit out of place. So I think the key takeaway from that is to really base your creative decisions on some kind of thematic or narrative justification, not just because it's the cool thing to do. But while that was quite a small, nitpicky comment, this next point was quite a bit of a larger one because it almost meant that the entire shoot got shut down. Always have a backup plan. So for one of the B-roll scenes, we really wanted to shoot Will in a lake, and we found this beautiful lake near his house, but I could not find anyone to contact to get permits, and this was very, very close to the shoot date. Will had said that he'd never really seen anyone there. It was a very quiet place. It was very secluded. So we took a gamble and we decided to just jump the fence and go and film in there. And we were waiting for the perfect kind of blue hour just before sunset. And I was getting very, very nervous because I knew that someone could come along and spot us at any point and kick us out. And then blue hour came, Brendan, the DP, and Will headed off into the water to start filming. And about 5 minutes into them filming, a van pulls up and two men come out and call me over to them and say, do you have permits to be here? So I told them the situation. I told them, no, we don't have permits, but we're just, a little short film crew, not doing anything commercial, just, want to get a couple of shots in the lake, we'll be out their hair. They weren't having any of it. They said, you need to move on. Luckily, Brendan had got everything that he needed to get before I had to come over and say, right, we need to go. But that very well could have gone a completely different way had they turned up even 20 minutes earlier. And I think the key takeaway for that is always have a backup plan, because I did not have a backup plan or a backup location or a backup scene that I would have shot if we had not shot that. And it was quite a crucial B-roll scene to shoot in terms of where I wanted to be in the narrative of the film. So particularly with documentaries where you're dealing with unknown elements, with contributors, with scenarios that you don't know necessarily what you're going into all of the time, I think it's so important to always have backup plans in place for any of your ideas or anything you want to shoot. So in the end, just like with any project I ever do, I learned lots and lots of things along the way. And actually, if you're not making mistakes along the way, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough and challenging yourself enough. So if there's one lesson kind of in totality that you take from this, it's to go out and make things despite the mistakes you're going to make along the way, and accept that you are going to make them, but through making the mistakes, you're going to get better and better and better.